Across the long, violent story of naval warfare, certain ships seem ill-starred from the moment they are conceived, not haunted by phantoms but by the choices and ambitions that brought them into being. They move from one disaster to the next, whispered about by sailors as if bad luck had taken up residence aboard. Of all the Second World War warships, few carry a narrative as relentlessly, almost poetically tragic as the Japanese heavy cruiser Moami. Her story begins not with the ringing of hammers in a dockyard, but in the quiet corridors of diplomacy. In 1930, delegates from the world's naval powers met in London to sign a treaty meant to stop another ruinously costly arms race. The London Naval Treaty put tight limits on the size and armament of warships, a decision celebrated in the West as a move toward peace. In Tokyo, it was felt as humiliation. Japan, rising as a maritime power, was effectively placed beneath Britain and the United States. To the Japanese Navy, it did not feel like peace, but like a restraint on ambition. Fleet planners quietly plotted a response. Their answer was as audacious as it was deceitful, a new class of cruisers that, on paper, complied with the treaty's restrictions. Official drawings described a light cruiser with 155mm guns, but every blueprint concealed the true intent. These hulls were built to accept much heavier armament and to be refitted with 10 enormous 8-inch guns the moment political circumstances allowed. It was a national sleight of hand, cheating not only in spirit but in steel. Moami was the lead ship of this secret program and the boast of Japanese shipbuilding. Yet the deception carried costs. To keep displacement within treaty limits, engineers turned to extensive electric welding, then a novel technique that saved crucial tons but produced seams more brittle than riveted joints. Her armor belt was thinner than it ought to have been, and her superstructure was kept light to accommodate the planned gun upgrade, leaving her dangerously top-heavy. In calm seas, she presented an imposing profile. In heavy weather, she proved unstable and unpredictable. When Moami slid down the ways at Kure Naval Arsenal, flags snapped and dignitaries smiled for the cameras as she gleamed in the sun, black hull and pale superstructure, a symbol of defiant pride. Sailors assigned to her must have felt the thrill of serving aboard the Navy's newest predator. Beneath that pride, however, lay an unspoken truth. Moami was as much a display piece as a weapon, built to mislead diplomats rather than to endure the ocean's fury or the chaos of combat. Her keel carried not only steel, but the burden of political pride, strategic deception, and dangerous compromise. Those hidden faults would one day demand a terrible price, paid in twisted metal and human lives. The question was not whether the reckoning would come, but when. A ship's maiden voyage, the shakedown cruise, is meant to be a careful trial of systems, a chance to find small faults before they become disasters, and for the crew to learn to trust the vessel beneath their feet. For Moami, it became something far darker, a grim portent of the calamities that would haunt her career. In September 1935, only months after commissioning, she joined the Japanese Fourth Fleet for maneuvers in the Western Pacific. Orders were simple: train, test, and prepare for war. Nature had other plans. Far out to sea, the weather turned, winds rose, swells grew taller, and the sky took on a heavy, foreboding cast. The fleet's meteorologists were competent, but Pacific typhoons were merciless. What struck the fleet was no ordinary storm but a monster, a super typhoon with waves towering over 60 feet and winds that howled like some ancient avenging spirit. As the storm swallowed the horizon, Moami and the other ships plunged into its heart. The sea ceased to be mere water and became moving mountains, lifting the cruisers toward the sky one moment and dropping them into black troughs the next. Spray was ripped from crests and hurled across decks like shards of glass. On Moami's bridge, officers could hear it, the ship itself beginning to cry out. The electric welds, once a point of pride, began to snap under the immense strain. Sharp reports echoed through the hull as seams failed. The thin plating of her bow buckled and warped, groaning under the relentless pounding. Her forward turrets, the very reason for her design, jammed solid in their barbettes. The ship's backbone flexed in ways steel should not, sending shudders through every deck. Below, in messes and engineering spaces, sailors clung to pipes and bulkheads, feeling the metal tremble around them and fearing that the next wave might break the ship in two. Moami was not alone. Across the fleet, destroyers returned with their bows sheared away, victims of the same obsessive weight-saving. Ships came back looking as if they'd been in battle, their sleek lines twisted and battered. When the fleet limped into port, the damage sparked a scandal within the Imperial Japanese Navy. An official inquiry tore into the design shortcomings and poor welding, exposing the risks taken in the name of speed and deception. The shame was so great that the Navy ordered a massive secret refit program for nearly every new ship. Moami was hauled into dry dock, her damaged hull opened up, the faulty welds replaced with riveted steel, and her plating thickened and reinforced. For the crew, it was an unspoken confession. Their ship had been launched with dangerous weaknesses. She had almost destroyed herself simply by sailing through a storm. Though her outward appearance could be restored, her reputation could not. From that day on, Moami earned a fleet-wide reputation for bad luck. A ship sailors no longer trusted to keep its men safe once the sea turned hostile. The typhoon had passed, but its mark on Moami never truly vanished. Despite the troubled circumstances of her construction and the whispering doubts that trailed her, Moami sailed into the Second World War looking impressive on paper. By late 1941, she had finally been outfitted with the 10 8-inch guns her designers had long planned, at last transformed into the heavy cruiser they had intended. In the opening campaigns of the Pacific War, she briefly seemed to have shaken off her ill fortune, steaming at the vanguard of Japan's rapid offensives and supporting landings in Malaya and Borneo, with her guns pounding Allied positions. And the crew allowed themselves a cautious pride. The shadow, though, had only retreated to wait. It reappeared in the confusion of one of the war's most frantic night actions. On the night of February 28, 1942, the battered Allied cruisers USS Houston and HMS Perth limped through the dark after the disaster in the Java Sea, low on fuel and ammunition and exhausted, only to stumble into the middle of a massive Japanese invasion force bound for Java. What followed in the blacked-out Sunda Strait was chaos. Searchlights stabbed the night, tracer beams arced over the water, and the surface erupted with the flashes of heavy guns. Moami and her sister Makuma were among the cruisers screening the transports, racing to intercept the intruders. In the confusion, Moami's captain ordered a full spread of 6 Type 93 long lance torpedoes toward the silhouettes believed to be enemy cruisers. Those torpedoes were feared for a reason, fast, stealthy, and packing massive warheads, but they found none of their intended targets. Houston and Perth twisted and dodged. The torpedoes slid past them and struck friendlies instead. Within minutes, Moami's salvo had ripped into a Japanese minesweeper and 4 troop transports, one of which carried Lieutenant General Hoshi Imamura, commander of the 16th Army, who was pitched into the oil-slicked water and barely survived. The Navy allowed him to believe an enemy submarine had been responsible, but the truth could not be fully concealed. The cruelty of it was bitter. In a single attack, Moami had inflicted more damage on her own invasion convoy than the enemy had, and hundreds of soldiers destined for Java sank without firing a shot. By dawn, the Allied cruisers were finished by combined Japanese fire, but the victory was poisoned. Moami's role in the catastrophe left a stain that no later action could completely erase. Moami kept fighting. She took part in the Indian Ocean raid in early 1942 and sank several merchant ships, but those were minor, uncontested successes that did little to wash away the shame murmured in other wardrooms. Her next major trial would come at Midway, in an operation Japanese admirals believed might decide the war. The plan was audacious: lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap with the carrier strike force, annihilate it, and clear the way for invasion. Moami and the other ships of Cruiser Division 7 were assigned to bombard Midway Island once the carriers had suppressed resistance. When June 4th arrived, nothing went to plan. Japan's carrier force was shattered in a sudden devastating U.S. counterstrike. 4 fleet carriers, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiru, were lost in hours. The invasion was called off, and the surviving ships were ordered to withdraw at maximum speed. In the dim pre-dawn of June 5th, Mogami and her division, under Rear Admiral Teo Kurita, raced away from the wreckage at high speed, every bridge tense with the knowledge they were in hostile waters and vulnerable to American subs and aircraft. Then, a lookout made out the silhouette of the submarine USS Tambour on the surface, and Kurita signaled an emergency maneuver, a sharp 45-degree turn to port to spoil any torpedo solution. The lead ships, Kumano and Suzuya, obeyed precisely, but the Ye, third ship in the column, Makuma, made a catastrophic error. Whether from a misread signal or panic, she swung a full 90-degree instead of 45-degree, cutting across the wake of the vessel following her. Moami, steaming at over 28 knots with thousands of tons behind her, had no time or room to avoid the collision. The captain ordered full astern and the helm hard over, but it was too late. In the darkness, Moami rammed Makuma's port quarter with a grinding, tearing impact. Moami's bow was crushed back nearly 40 feet, bent like a crushed bellows, while Makuma's hull was ripped open below the waterline and poured fuel into the sea in a wide, shimmering slick. Stranded in hostile waters after a crushing defeat, 2 of Japan's mightiest cruisers had managed to maim one another without a single enemy shot landing on them. Damage control teams scrambled to plug breaches and brace buckled plating. Moami's once proud bow now resembled the ragged tooth of a shattered blade. Both ships limped at a crawl, helpless against the daylight that would surely bring enemy aircraft, and every sailor felt the weight of another self-inflicted disaster added to the vessel's growing tale of ill luck. Lightning flickered in the eastern sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, American planes were closing in. The nighttime collision had left Moami and Makuma staggering across the Pacific, trailing a wide, glistening slick of fuel that marked their positions for any searching planes. Rear Admiral Kurita faced an excruciating choice and decided to send the unharmed cruisers racing for safety, leaving the crippled pair with only 2 destroyers as escort. At dawn, the inevitable arrived. Dark specks swelled into waves of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, the same aircraft that had shattered Japan's carrier strength days before. Makuma was found first. The fuel pouring from her hull made her a bright target on the sea. The dive bombers dove, releasing their loads with brutal accuracy. Bombs tore into her decks and set raging fires. The heat ignited the torpedoes still in her tubes, triggering a chain of catastrophic explosions that blew the ship apart from within and turned her into an inferno, black smoke billowing like a funeral pyre. Moami was hit next. Bombs struck amidships, wrecking one of her main turrets and sparking fires that swept from the flight deck down into the compartments below, straight into the improvised sick bay where collision casualties were being treated. Damage control. Crews faced an unbearable choice: seal off compartments to stop the blaze from reaching the magazines, or keep them open to try to rescue the wounded and risk detonating the ship. They chose the vessel. Hatches were secured and the injured were left inside, their cries echoing in the memories of those who survived. Yet a single earlier decision spared Moami the fate Makuma suffered. Before the air attack began, her damage control officer, sensing the peril, had ordered all torpedoes and unused ordnance thrown overboard. It was an extreme step. Those weapons were the ship's striking power, but it removed the danger of devastating secondary explosions. When bombs struck and set compartments alight, the absence of torpedoes prevented a fatal chain reaction. The crew battled the flames with grim resolve. Decks were slick with seawater, oil, and blood, and the air was thick with smoke and the taste of scorched metal as the ship shuddered under near misses. Still, she stayed afloat. By late afternoon, the American attackers withdrew. Moami, badly damaged and burning, survived while Makuma slipped beneath the waves, taking hundreds of men and becoming the first Japanese cruiser lost in the war. Survival was no triumph. Moami was a wreck, her bow smashed, her decks scarred, and her crew grieving comrades lost to fire and sea. But she endured. The return to Japan was a slow, painful crawl. Moami's shattered bow gouged through every swell, each wave testing her weakened frame. She reached home a ruin and a public, symbol of the Midway humiliation. For almost a year, she lay in the CBO naval arsenal while her bow was cut away and rebuilt from the keel up. The scars were more than physical. While Moami was under repair, the Imperial Japanese Navy confronted a bitter new truth. The carrier, fleet, once the nation's pride, had been gutted. Veteran air crews were gone, and the Americans held the initiative, so naval thinkers began to try desperate, unconventional fixes. One such solution was grafted onto Moami. She would be rebuilt, not merely as a heavy cruiser, but as a hybrid able to launch her own scout aircraft. Her two aft 8-inch turrets were removed and replaced with an elongated flight deck and hangars capable of holding up to 11 Aichi E-16A Zwan float planes. Born of necessity, the conversion was meant to restore reconnaissance capability without carriers. By April 1943, she slipped out of the yard changed. A stubby new bow, the streamlined forward silhouette of a cruiser, and an odd, flat stern that made her unlike any other ship in the fleet. Sailors who first saw her were struck by the awkward, mix of elegance and strangeness, a ship that seemed half predator and half experiment. Whatever ill fortune clung to her seemed undiminished. On her very first trials in Tokyo Bay, she clipped the oiler Toamaru. The damage was slight, but the message was savage. After a year in dock for one catastrophic collision, the first thing she did was strike another friendly ship, and the dark. Jokes began to spread like wildfire among sailors who already mistrusted her reputation. A ship that could not even leave the bay without hitting a comrade seemed doomed to repeat the same misfortunes at sea. Weeks later, on June 8, 1943, disaster erupted nearby while Moami lay at anchor in Hashirajima. The battleship Mutsu suffered. A massive magazine explosion broke in two and sank with more than 1,000 men lost. Moami's crew lowered boats and scoured the churned water, but were too distant to make any meaningful rescue. Although she had nothing to do with the catastrophe, her being there felt like another grim footnote, and whispers that she was a harbinger of misfortune hardened into a reputation that no amount of heroism could wash away. By the summer of 1944, Moami was back in service, but the Navy was now firmly on the defensive. The hybrid cruiser filled a peculiar niche, yet it could not erase a trail of accidents, near misses and tragedies that seemed to follow her wherever she sailed. Sailors who served on her learned to live with the sense that something unseen was waiting just beyond the horizon. They carried a mixture of pride in their ship, resignation to her fate, and a quiet hope that the next disaster might spare them. By autumn, the naval situation had become desperate. The once mighty combined fleet was reduced to a shadow of itself, ships lost in great numbers, fuel reserves dwindling to the point of paralysis, pilots green and undertrained, and the Americans advancing inexorably across the Pacific. Commanders conceived one last gamble, Operation Shogo, to throw all remaining warships into a single decisive action against the U.S. invasion of the Philippines. Moami was drawn into Vice Admiral Shuji Nishimura's southern force with orders that were stark and nearly hopeless. Steam through the Surigao Strait at night, slip behind the American landing area at Leyte, and smash the transports in a surprise strike that might delay or even briefly cripple the invasion. Everyone aboard knew it was essentially a suicide dash. Some penned farewell notes to families they would never see again. Others sat smoking silently on the darkened decks and watched the black water slide by as if trying to memorize the world before it ended. In the early hours of October 25th, Nishimura's small column, 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers, entered the confined channel under oppressive night. The air was thick, the shorelines cloaked. In jungle, and the sense of entrapment grew with every passing mile. American PT boats darted in and out like predatory insects, loosing torpedoes and disappearing into the darkness. Then came the destroyers, attacking with deadly effectiveness and sowing confusion across the Japanese formation. Fate struck Moami. Another bitter blow when the already damaged battleship Fuso, disoriented in the chaos and reeling from torpedo hits, mistook her silhouette for an enemy ship and poured shells into her superstructure. Explosions ripped across her decks, killing sailors instantly and leaving many others wounded. For the second time in her career, she had been struck by friendly fire, a bitter humiliation made even worse by the terror of battle raging around them. The battered column pressed on, only to run straight into Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's ambush. The American battle line, 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and more than 24 destroyers, waited perfectly positioned to rake the Japanese approach. Within minutes, the force was overwhelmed. Nishimura's flagship Yamashiro was blasted apart and sank quickly, leaving chaos behind. Moami now became the focus of concentrated fire. 8-inch shells smashed into her bridge, killing the captain and command staff instantly. Another struck the engine control area, leaving her nearly helpless. Left leaderless, blind, and burning, she staggered on defiantly, returning fire as best she could. Then, in a cruel echo of earlier misfortune, a second Japanese group under Admiral Shima emerged from the opposite direction. Out of the smoke loomed the heavy cruiser Nachi, closing fast and on a collision course. Despite desperate maneuvers, the impact was unavoidable. With a grinding crash, Nachi rammed Moami's starboard side, the force twisting steel and throwing men from their feet. For the second time in her career, she had collided with a friendly cruiser in the middle of combat. Both vessels pulled apart, scarred and burning, but the battle was already beyond saving. Oldendorf's guns continued to thunder, and American aircraft hovered above, ready to finish the work. Moami lay a shattered hulk, her decks strewn with dead and wounded, her engines faltering, her silhouette lit by fires that ate through her compartments. Still, her surviving sailors fought desperately to keep her moving, clinging to the slimmest chance of escape. By dawn on October 25th, Moami was barely recognizable. Her decks were torn and blackened, her once sharp lines warped into grotesque ruin. Fire still smoldered in her gutted interior, and oily smoke curled into the gray Philippine sky. The sea lapped at her battered hull with a rhythm that mocked her helplessness. Everyone aboard felt the end approaching. The final blow came from above. Aircraft from U.S. escort carriers discovered the crippled cruiser and pounced. Bombs and at least one aerial torpedo ripping into what little structure remained intact. The blasts shook her to the core and extinguished the last embers of hope. Junior officers, suddenly in command after the captain's death, ordered the wounded transferred to the destroyer Akabono. It was a hurried, grim evacuation carried out under a pall of smoke. The decks of Akabono filled with soot-streaked men, many silent, others casting lingering glances at the vessel that had been their home and their curse. At 12:40 p.m., with survivors safe aboard, the order was given. Akabono fired a single long lance into Moami's side. A deep, rolling explosion thundered. The ship shuddered once more, and then, slowly and almost reluctantly, she slipped beneath the Mindanao Sea, leaving only oil and debris to mark her grave. Her strange, ill-fated career had come to its end. In Oi. The years since, sailors and historians have debated whether Moami was truly cursed. The notion is seductive, for how else to account for a near breakup in a typhoon, catastrophic friendly fire, 2 collisions with sister cruisers, multiple incidents of being struck by her own side's shells, and a succession of smaller accidents, both in and out of combat. The sheer improbability makes superstition easy to embrace, yet the truth, while less romantic, is more revealing. Moami was born of political deception, designed to bend a treaty rather than as a vessel optimized for war. Her compromises, thin armor, brittle welds, and instability were part of her from the very beginning. She sailed under a command system that valued obedience above initiative, a culture where small mistakes could cascade into catastrophe. The calamities at Sunda Strait and Midway were not the vengeance of fate, but the consequence of flawed design, chaotic night battles, and human error under stress. Still, there is a grim symmetry to her story. The American admiral who destroyed her at Surigao Strait, Jesse Oldendorf, had once commanded USS Houston, the very cruiser Moami helped to sink in 1942, so history, in its cold and impersonal way, had come full circle. Perhaps that is why her tale endures. She was more than a string of mishaps and unlucky turns. She embodied the Imperial Japanese Navy itself, ambitious, powerful in moments, but crippled by overreach, internal flaws, and the weight of a relentless enemy. Her destruction was not merely the sinking of a ship, but the symbolic collapse of the ideals and strategies that had built her. As the waters closed over her broken hull, she carried those lessons into silence. Not as a ghostly curse, but as a reminder of the cost of pride and of how